My daughter-in-law shot a look of pure contempt at my son as he made his way into the courtroom. But the moment the judge saw me enter behind him, he went rigid and gasped in a low voice, "What are you doing here?" A hush fell over the entire room as my daughter-in-law and her smug family exchanged panicked glances. I'm so glad you could join me. If you're enjoying this story, please give this video a like, subscribe to my channel, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I'd love to see how far my story of justice has traveled. The buzzing chatter in the courtroom ceased the instant Judge Peterson walked in. He settled into his high-backed chair, his sharp eyes surveying the scene. When his gaze fell on Thomas, my son, I saw a flash of sympathy, but then he froze, his eyes locking onto me. I could feel the shock in his stare, as if he was looking at a ghost from a long-forgotten time. I walked with deliberate steps toward the plaintiff's table. I set my worn-out leather briefcase down on the polished wood. The solid thud resonated like a drumbeat signaling the start of a battle. I pulled out the chair and sat down beside Thomas, placing my hand over his, feeling it tremble. The room was utterly still. The only sound was the faint scratching of the clerk's pen. Judge Peterson leaned in, his eyes wide, his typical composure gone. His lips parted, and he asked in a voice barely above a whisper, "Why have you come?" That single question sent a chill through the room. Claire's brow furrowed, her eyes narrowing with suspicion as she looked at me. Her parents began whispering urgently, their expressions filled with mistrust. Thomas raised his head, his face a mixture of confusion and a tiny, fragile glimmer of hope. Seeing him that way made my heart ache. He had no idea. No one in that room knew that I was more than just a mother. I was once someone else, a person everyone in Denver knew and spoke of with respect. Less than an hour earlier, the Denver sky had been a blanket of heavy gray. I stood by our car, gently helping Thomas with every move. His steps were unsteady, not just from the polished oak cane he leaned on, but from the weight of the crowd's cold stares. The bells from the cathedral on the nearby plaza chimed, each somber note a blow to my chest, heralding a difficult day. I clutched the old leather briefcase, its scuffed corners a reminder of all the years that had passed. It didn't just contain documents. It held the future of my family and our last remaining hope. On the grand steps of the courthouse, a small group had formed. Some curious onlookers, a few reporters with their cameras poised. Their murmurs were like the hum of anxious bees. "It's the Davenport divorce," someone whispered. "I hear it's a messy one." That poor man. The word struck me with a dull pain, but I kept my expression impassive, refusing to show any vulnerability. Just then, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb behind us. The door swung open and Claire emerged. She was wearing a vibrant blue Armani dress, the color of defiance, as if declaring to the world that she was the victor. Oversized sunglasses hid her eyes, but they couldn't conceal the smug smile playing on her lips. Her parents and her brother trailed behind her, their chins held high, striding as if they had already won. The sight of them made my stomach churn. They knew nothing of what Thomas and I had been through. The sleepless nights, the endless struggle to build and keep our home. I gestured for Thomas to go ahead, and I followed him silently. My son, once so vibrant and strong, now relied on a cane, his shoulders slumped as if carrying an invisible burden. Every step he took was a fresh wound in my heart. I wanted to scream, to shield him from those pitying stares, but I could only grip my briefcase tighter and walk with a calm I did not feel. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the scent of old paper and palpable tension. Claire was already at the defendant's table, her legs crossed, one of her bright blue heels tapping an impatient rhythm on the floor. When Thomas limped in, she smirked and leaned toward her mother, speaking just loud enough to be heard. "Look at him, a broken man." My blood ran hot, but I bit my tongue to keep my anger in check. Thomas lowered his head, his shoulders heaving slightly. He sat down heavily in the plaintiff's chair, his hands gripping his cane as if it were a lifeline. Seeing my son so defeated tore me apart. This was the boy I had given my entire life to, the one who had promised to build us a home where we would always be safe. And now, here he was, being humiliated by the very woman who had once vowed to love him. Claire's lawyer, a sharp-looking woman named Ms. Sharp, stood and placed a thick file on the table. Her confident voice filled the room. "We will prove that my client's husband, Thomas Davenport, is no longer fit to manage his duties as a husband or a father." Each word was like a hammer blow. I wanted to leap to my feet and shout that they were liars, that Thomas was still a father, a man of dignity, even if his body had failed him. But I held my peace, biding my time. The heavy atmosphere of the courtroom transported me back in time. Years ago, when the warm sun still seemed to shine on our little corner of the world, my small family had known happiness. Our home, though modest, was always echoing with laughter. I remember those Saturday afternoons when Thomas was a little boy, racing around the yard with a scuffed-up football, singing the classic rock songs I'd taught him. My husband, Richard, was still a family man back then, sitting on the porch, watching his son with a quiet smile. But that peace, as I would learn, was as fragile as glass. One evening, with the scent of the roast chicken I'd cooked still hanging in the air, Richard set down his silverware, his expression unreadable. "Eleanor," he said, his voice flat, "I'm leaving. I've found someone else." I stood there, a serving spoon in my hand, completely stunned. He didn't meet my eyes. He just stood up, grabbed the suitcase that was already packed by the door, and walked out. A fancy car was waiting for him at the curb. In the glow of the streetlight, I could just make out the silhouette of a woman, a wealthy heiress who, I later found out, had stolen my husband. Thomas, who was just 10, stood frozen in the hallway, his eyes wide as he watched his father's figure vanish. The sound of the car driving away left a silence that shattered my soul. That night, after I'd cleared the dinner table as if it were any other night, I went to Thomas's room. He was curled up under his blankets, his small body shaking with silent sobs. I sat on the edge of his bed and pulled him into my arms, but I didn't shed a tear. I couldn't. I had to be strong for him. "Mom," he asked in a choked whisper, "why did Daddy go?" I held him tighter. "I don't know, sweetheart," I whispered back, "but I promise you, it will always be you and me." I held on to that promise with every fiber of my being. Though every night after he was asleep, I would sit alone in the quiet kitchen, staring at the empty chairs, feeling a pain that felt bottomless. The years that followed were a blur of hard work. I'd wake before dawn, make Thomas breakfast, and see him off to school. By day, I worked as a paralegal, my fingers flying across the keyboard, trying to ignore the exhaustion that was my constant companion. At night, while Thomas studied, I'd pore over legal briefs and case files, taking on freelance work to make ends meet. I remember nights of heavy snow when Thomas and I would huddle together under a single coat, trudging through the drifts to get home. Even with my clothes damp and the cold seeping into my bones, I'd squeeze his hand and smile. "We're tougher than any snowstorm, right?" Thomas would nod, and his smile was my only source of warmth in those bleak times. I never told him about the nights I lay awake, worrying about the mortgage, the bills, the cost of his school supplies. Once, when he was sick with a bad flu, I had to scour the city for a pharmacy that was open late, with only a few dollars in my wallet. At the counter, I counted out my change, my heart sinking with the fear that I might have to choose between his medicine and food for the next day. But I never gave up. Every time I looked at my son, I knew I couldn't falter. He was my reason for everything. The day Thomas got his acceptance letter to study architecture at the State University, I just stood in the kitchen, holding the letter, and wept. It was the first time in years I'd cried tears of joy. But my happiness was quickly tempered by worry. I couldn't afford the tuition. Without a word, I went to my old jewelry box and took out the pearl necklace my mother had given me, the last remnant of a life I'd left behind. It was the only valuable thing I had left. I took it to a downtown jeweler, and watching him weigh the pearls in his hand felt like he was weighing a piece of my soul. "Mom, you didn't have to do that," Thomas said when he found out, his eyes glistening. "I can get a job." I stopped him, placing a hand on his arm. "Your only job is to study. I want you to have the future I never could." Thomas hugged me, and in that moment, I felt he was no longer a boy needing my protection, but a young man on the cusp of his own life. And he didn't disappoint me. After years of relentless effort, he designed and built a beautiful 2-story house on the edge of Denver. The day he gave me the keys, I stood before it and cried again. "I promised you, Mom," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "This is our home. No one can ever make us leave." I embraced him, feeling all the work, the sacrifice, and the love he had poured into every beam and brick. For the first time in a very long time, I felt like we were truly safe. When Thomas married Claire, I believed our family was finally whole. Claire back then seemed like a dream. She was charming, with a laugh that could light up a room. In the early days, she would join me in the kitchen, chattering excitedly about her and Thomas's future. "Eleanor, I want a house full of kids, so you'll be surrounded by grandchildren," she'd once told me. And I believed her. I truly thought our struggles were over. I saw the way Thomas's face lit up whenever she was near, and I was grateful. But our happiness was short-lived. A structural failure at a construction site, a fall from a high floor. The call came late one night, the site foreman's panicked voice on the other end. "Mrs. Davenport, it's Thomas. There's been an accident. You need to get to the hospital." I ran from the house, my heart pounding against my ribs. When I arrived, the sight of Thomas, so still and wrapped in bandages, was burned into my memory forever. I stayed by his side, watching the strong young man who had been our rock reduced to someone so fragile. "I'm here, Thomas," I whispered, holding his hand. "Mom's right here." The months that followed were an endless blur of hospital visits and physical therapy. Thomas slowly recovered, but his leg was permanently damaged. The doctor said he would walk with a cane for the rest of his life. The vibrant, talkative man I knew receded, replaced by a quiet, somber version of himself. He rarely smiled, and his eyes were often distant and filled with a deep sadness. Every time I saw him struggling with his cane, taking slow, careful steps across the living room, it felt like my own heart was breaking. When Thomas finally came home from the hospital, our world had changed completely. The beautiful house he had built, once a place of joy, now felt suffocatingly quiet. I moved his bedroom downstairs to the study so he wouldn't have to deal with the stairs. Every time I looked at the bed I'd set up for him, my soul ached. That room was supposed to be a nursery for their future children, but now it was a sick room for a man battling his own body. For the first few weeks, Claire played the part of the dutiful wife. She'd bring him meals, remind him to take his medication, and even manage a smile when I thanked her. I wanted to believe she still loved him, that this was just a difficult adjustment for her. But as the days turned into weeks, I saw that it was all an act. Claire's patience wore out with alarming speed. One morning, as the sun was just beginning to rise, I found Thomas sitting by the window, a hopeful look in his eyes. "Mom, I'd like to sit in the garden today," he said, his voice surprisingly cheerful. "I need some fresh air. Could you ask Claire to help me?" I nodded, my heart lifting to see this small spark of his old self. I found Claire in the kitchen, already dressed to go out. "Claire, Thomas would like to go out to the garden. Can you give him a hand?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. She turned, an annoyed expression on her face. "I have a million things to do today, Eleanor," she replied curtly. "Can't he just manage for once?" Without waiting for an answer, she grabbed her purse and walked out, the front door slamming behind her. I went back to the study and saw Thomas still sitting by the window, his gaze now fixed on the floor, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "It's okay, Mom. Never mind," he whispered, so quietly I could barely hear him. I wanted to chase after Claire and scream at her, but looking at my son's defeated face, I could only push his chair out into the garden myself, forcing a smile to hide the anger that was churning inside me. Our family dinners, which had always been a time of warmth and connection, became agonizing. I'd cook Thomas's favorite dishes, hoping to tempt his appetite and lift his spirits. But Claire would just sit there, picking at her food before declaring she wasn't hungry. I remembered how she used to rave about my cooking, begging me for recipes. Now she looked at her husband with open irritation, as if his very presence at the table was an unbearable chore. "Are you feeling all right, Claire?" I asked one evening, trying to break the heavy silence. She just shrugged. "I'm fine, just not hungry." But I knew it wasn't the food that had stolen her appetite. It was Thomas and the life she was now trapped in. One afternoon, as I was walking past their bedroom, I heard Claire's voice through the door. She was on the phone, speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone. "Don't worry. Once the house is sold and the assets are split, we'll have more than enough to get started." I froze, my blood running cold. The house, the home Thomas had poured his heart and soul into. The home that was supposed to be our fortress. It was now just a prize in her greedy scheme. I wanted to burst in and confront her, but I stopped myself. I needed more than just a suspicion. I needed undeniable proof. And I needed to shield Thomas from this brutal truth for as long as I could. Claire's appearance began to change, too. Her simple, tasteful clothes were replaced by flashy, expensive outfits. Her perfume was overpowering, and she started going out almost every night, using flimsy excuses about meeting friends. I'd watch her go, the sharp click of her heels echoing on the hardwood floor, and my heart would sink. I remembered the early days of their marriage, when she and Thomas would hold hands and talk endlessly about their future. Now, every time she walked out that door, I felt she was leaving a piece of him behind. The neighborhood gossip eventually reached me. One day at the local market, Mrs. Gable, the kind woman who ran the produce stand, pulled me aside. "Eleanor," she whispered, "I don't mean to pry, but I've seen your daughter-in-law at that new cafe downtown with a man. They seem very close." I forced a smile and thanked her, but inside, my fears had solidified into a painful certainty. The pieces were all falling into place. Claire was no longer the woman I had welcomed into our family. She had become a stranger, with a cold-hearted plan I was only beginning to understand. The final straw came one night when Thomas was in a great deal of pain. I heard him groan from his room and call out weakly, "Claire, can you help me with my leg? It's really hurting." I stood in the hallway, praying for a moment of compassion from her. Instead, I heard her sharp reply, her voice like ice. "I'm not your nurse, Thomas. If you need a caretaker, you should hire one." I stood there, my hand frozen on the wall, feeling as if I'd been stabbed. Thomas went silent. He didn't say another word, but I knew those cruel words had cut him deeper than any physical pain. The house, once so full of life, was now entombed in silence. Every night, I would sit on the porch, my heart aching. I thought about the days when Thomas was healthy, when he would hug Claire and say, "Mom, I found the one." I had believed it. I had hoped Claire would be his happiness. But the love in her eyes had been replaced by cold calculation. Every time I looked at Thomas with his cane and his empty eyes, I felt like I had failed him. Failed as a mother who was supposed to protect her child from all harm. One gloomy afternoon, I had just finished setting the table for tea when the front door opened. Claire walked in, but she wasn't alone. With her was Ms. Sharp, a lawyer I recognized from my past life, though her expression was now cold and professional. She carried a leather briefcase and moved with an air of authority that seemed to suck all the warmth out of the room. My heart sank as I remembered a time when we were on the same side, fighting for justice. Now, she looked at me as if I were a complete stranger. Claire, in a dress as sharp as her lawyer's demeanor, sat down without even looking at Thomas. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. She slid a stack of papers across the table toward my son, her voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Sign them. It's a divorce petition. By law, the house will be split 50-50. The words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Thomas. His face, already pale, turned ashen. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table. I placed a glass of water down and fought to keep my voice steady, though a storm of rage was building inside me. "On what grounds are you claiming this house is marital property?" Claire tilted her chin up, her expression so brazen it was sickening. "We're married. Any assets acquired during the marriage are split. It's the law, Eleanor." Her words were an insult to the years of my son's life that he had poured into this home. I took a slow, deep breath. "You are mistaken, Claire. This house is Thomas's sole property. He purchased the land and built it years before you were married. It is legally his, and his alone." The room went silent. Thomas looked up, and for the first time, a flicker of hope ignited in his eyes. Ms. Sharp, who had been sitting quietly, finally spoke, her voice precise and cutting. "Mrs. Davenport, in this state's marital law, there are provisions where separate property can be reclassified as marital property after a significant period of cohabitation. You should be careful with your claims." I looked her directly in the eyes, this woman who had once admired me, who had called me her mentor. "Ms. Sharp," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument, "I know the law better than anyone in this room." The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas stared at me, a look of awe and pride dawning on his face that I hadn't seen since before his accident. But Claire was not done. She leaped to her feet, her voice rising to a shrill cry. "I don't care what you think you know. I just want to be free of this burden. He's an invalid, and I have my whole life ahead of me." Those words were a final, brutal blow to Thomas. He just sat there, his shoulders shaking, his voice cracking as he whispered, "Claire, is that really how you feel?" She wouldn't even look at him. Her silence was more damning than any confession. My heart felt like it was being torn from my chest. My son, my pride and joy, was being called a burden by the woman he loved. I wanted to lash out, to tell her she was unworthy of his love, but I remained frozen, my hands gripping the back of a chair to keep from collapsing. Ms. Sharp guided a fuming Claire out of the house, leaving the divorce papers on the table like a permanent scar. The door slammed shut, leaving Thomas and me in a deafening silence. I started to clear the table, needing something to do with my hands, needing to avoid the pain in my son's eyes. But my hands were shaking so badly that a teacup slipped and shattered on the floor. The sound echoed the way my heart was breaking. Thomas was still sitting at the table, his gaze lost in the papers. "Mom," he said, his voice barely audible. "What did I do to make her hate me so much?" I didn't answer immediately. I went to him and placed my hand on his shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," I said, my own voice choked with emotion. "She is the one who is wrong, not you." But I knew the truth was far more complicated. Claire didn't just want to leave him. She wanted to strip him of everything he had ever worked for. This house, built with his own hands, was now the target of her cold, calculated greed. I thought of all our struggles, of the pearl necklace I had sold, of his promise that we would always have a home. Now, all of it was under attack, not by a stranger, but by the woman Thomas had trusted with his heart. That night, I sat on the porch for a long time, the cold air doing nothing to numb the turmoil inside me. I knew this was only the beginning of a long and ugly fight. In the days that followed, the divorce papers on the dining room table seemed to cast a dark shadow over the entire house. The air was so thick with unspoken grief it felt hard to breathe. I watched Thomas move through the rooms like a ghost, his meals uneaten, his face a mask of sorrow. He wouldn't talk about it, just retreat to his room with his cane, his stooped shoulders telling a story of profound heartbreak. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it would all be all right. But I knew that words were useless against this kind of pain. One night, I couldn't sleep. The moonlight cast long shadows across my bedroom floor. I thought of Thomas, of the promise I'd made to him as a little boy, that I would always protect him. And now, the person he had loved most was the one causing him the most harm. I felt utterly helpless. I finally got up to get a glass of water. As I passed the room Claire and Lily, my granddaughter, shared, I heard voices. Claire's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the quiet of the house. Lily, listen to me. Tomorrow in court, when the judge asks, you tell him your father can't take care of you. You tell him you don't want to live with a cripple. Do you understand? My heart stopped. I stood frozen in the hallway, the glass in my hand threatening to fall. Then I heard Lily's small, trembling voice. But I don't want to lie, Mommy. I love Daddy. Her little voice was thick with tears, a sound that broke my heart. Claire's reply was harsh, impatient. If you don't do what I say, we'll lose everything. Do you want to end up poor, living with your grandmother and your useless father? I stood there, my chest so tight I could barely breathe. The water from the glass spilled over my trembling hand. Claire, the woman I had once thought of as a daughter, was trying to turn my sweet, innocent 8-year-old granddaughter into a liar, forcing her to betray her own father. A wave of rage washed over me, so powerful it almost brought me to my knees. Lily, my precious granddaughter, was being forced to make an impossible choice. I backed away silently, returning to my room before they could hear me. I sat on my bed and buried my face in my hands, trying to stifle my sobs. I thought of Thomas, of how he used to carry Lily on his shoulders, her laughter filling the house. Grandma, she'd once told me, her eyes shining, I'm going to be an artist when I grow up. Thomas had hugged her and whispered, You can be anything you want, sweetheart. Daddy will always believe in you. Now Claire was trying to destroy that bond, to use their daughter as a weapon. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let my granddaughter's heart be poisoned by lies and manipulation. The next morning, I rose before the sun. I found Lily in the backyard, her eyes red and puffy. I sat beside her on the small garden bench. Sweetheart, I said gently, I overheard you and your mom last night. I know you're scared. Lily looked at me, her lower lip trembling, and then she burst into tears, throwing her arms around my neck. Grandma, I don't want to do it, she sobbed. I don't want to leave Daddy. I don't want to lie. I held her close, feeling her small body shake against mine. Don't be afraid, Lily, I said, my voice firm despite the tears in my own eyes. Grandma is here. You won't have to lie. The truth is always the strongest. She looked up at me, her big blue eyes filled with tears. But Mommy said she won't let me see Daddy anymore if I don't, she whispered. I wiped her tears away, my heart aching but my resolve hardening. Your mommy is wrong, I said with absolute certainty. No one can keep you from your daddy. I promise you, we will get through this. Lily nodded, squeezing my hand, and in that moment, I knew I was no longer just fighting for my son. I was fighting for my granddaughter's future, for her right to grow up surrounded by love and truth, not deceit and fear. After overhearing that conversation, I knew I had to act, but I also knew that my word against Claire's wouldn't be enough. I needed cold, hard evidence, something that would shatter the facade of the loving wife she was trying to project. And so, I reached out to an old friend from a life I had long since left behind, Frank Miller, a private investigator who had been my go-to man back when I was a prosecutor. His office was tucked away in a downtown alley, smelling of stale coffee and old secrets. When I walked in, he was sitting behind a cluttered desk. He looked up, and his eyes widened in surprise. "Eleanor," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "My God, it's been years. I thought you'd hung it up for good." I gave him a weak smile. My past. The days when they called me the Iron Orchid for my unyielding pursuit of justice felt like a lifetime ago. But for my family, I had to become that person again. I sat down and told him everything. Thomas's accident, Claire's sudden change, the divorce, and her plan to manipulate Lily. Frank listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. "I see," he said when I had finished. "Leave it with me, Eleanor. But be prepared. The truth isn't always pretty." I nodded, my hands clenched in my lap. "I'm prepared, Frank. I just need the truth, no matter how ugly it is." A few days later, Frank called me to a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city. He slid a manila envelope across the table. I opened it, and my breath caught in my throat. Inside were photographs. Claire, laughing, on the arm of a handsome, well-dressed man, leaving an expensive hotel. She looked happier and more carefree than I had seen her in years. A stark contrast to the sullen, resentful woman she was at home. I picked up a photo, my hand shaking. "His name is Marcus Thorne," Frank said quietly. "A real estate developer with a reputation for charming wealthy women and then taking them for everything they have. He's got a team of lawyers who make all his problems disappear." I looked at another photo, where Claire was wearing a diamond bracelet I'd never seen before. "This is more than an affair, isn't it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "This is a plan. She wants Thomas's house, and Thorne is helping her." My heart ached with a mixture of sorrow and fury. While my son was struggling with every step, the wife he had loved was out with another man, plotting to take away the very home he had built for their family. "How deep does it go?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Frank sighed. "Deep. I found hotel bills, flight records, even wire transfers from Thorne's company to a private account in her name. This is a business deal, Eleanor." I paid Frank and asked him to keep digging. "I need everything you can find," I told him. He nodded, his expression one of understanding. "You haven't changed a bit, Eleanor," he said. "Still tough as nails. But be careful. This Thorne guy plays dirty." I knew he was right, but I had no choice. This wasn't just a divorce anymore. It was a war. That night, I hid the envelope in a locked drawer. I couldn't let Thomas see it. He had suffered enough. During dinner, Claire, dressed in another new expensive outfit, casually brought up the house. "You know, Eleanor," she said, "I was thinking we should sell this place. We could get a nice luxury condo downtown. It's so dull out here." I looked her right in the eye, my gaze like ice. "This house is the product of my son's life's work," I said, my voice low and sharp. "It is not something to be sold on a whim." She bristled, about to retort, but then seemed to think better of it and fell silent. I glanced at Lily, who was avoiding my gaze, and I felt a fresh wave of determination. I would not let this woman destroy my family. The morning of the first hearing was cold and gray. I helped Thomas from the car, his steps slow and labored. He tried to smile at me. "I'm okay, Mom," he said, but his trembling voice betrayed him. I squeezed his hand, wishing I could absorb his pain into myself. Across the street, a limousine pulled up. Claire emerged, dressed in a stunning red suit, a victorious smile on her face. Her family followed, laughing and chattering as if they were arriving at a party. The sight of them made me sick. They had no idea of the sacrifice, the love, that had been poured into our home. To them, it was just a prize to be won. Inside the courtroom, Thomas sat hunched over, his eyes fixed on the floor. I stood behind him, a silent guardian. Claire took her seat, her red heels tapping a smug rhythm. Her lawyer, Ms. Sharp, stood and began. "Your Honor, my client, Mrs. Claire Davenport, has been living in an untenable situation with a disabled husband. Mr. Davenport is unable to work, unable to fulfill his duties as a husband, and unable to provide for his child. We request a divorce and an equitable division of assets, including 50% of the value of the family home. Every word was a lie, a distortion of the truth. Claire then added her own venom. "He's a burden," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "I deserve a real life, not this." That was too much for Thomas. He struggled to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane, his voice choked with emotion. I can still take care of my daughter," he stammered. "I'm still her father." But the words caught in his throat. His face flushed, and I saw tears welling up in his eyes as his composure finally broke. Claire let out a cruel, heartless laugh. "Look at you, Thomas. You can barely stand. Who are you kidding?" A murmur went through the courtroom, and I saw the pitying looks directed at my son. My heart shattered. My strong, proud son, humiliated and broken in front of a room full of strangers. I knew then that I had to act. I stood up and walked calmly to the plaintiff's table. I opened my old leather briefcase and placed it on the table with a resonant thud. I pulled a chair up next to Thomas. Then I rose to my feet, my voice ringing out clear and strong. "From this moment forward, I, Eleanor Davenport, will be acting as legal counsel for my son, Mr. Thomas Davenport." The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Ms. Sharp stared at me, her mouth agape. Claire's face went white, as if she'd seen a ghost. A whisper started to ripple through the older members of the gallery. Eleanor Davenport. Could that be? I kept my gaze fixed on Judge Peterson. He tapped his gavel lightly, his own voice unsteady with disbelief and a hint of respect. "Mrs. Eleanor Davenport, are you, by any chance, the Iron Orchid?" The question hung in the air, and the whispering grew louder. Thomas looked at me, his tear-filled eyes wide with a dawning understanding, as if seeing his mother for the very first time. I nodded, my voice steady. "Your Honor, my belief in justice has never wavered." The words were for the judge, for Thomas, and for myself. I felt a long, dormant fire rekindling within me. I glanced at Claire and saw her flinch. The smug confidence had vanished from her face. Ms. Sharp lowered her head, knowing she was now facing an opponent she could not so easily dismiss. At the next hearing, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread through Denver that the Iron Orchid had returned. I walked in with Thomas, his hand on my arm. He was still trembling, but I could see a new light in his eyes. Hope. Claire was at the defendant's table, looking tense. Her family sat behind her, their previous boisterousness replaced by anxious silence. Judge Peterson called the court to order and nodded for me to begin. I stood, opened my briefcase, and laid out my first piece of evidence. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and steady, "I present the property deeds for the house in question. These documents clearly show that the property was purchased and the house constructed by my son, Thomas Davenport, a full 2 years before his marriage to Mrs. Claire Davenport." The clerk examined the documents and confirmed their authenticity. A murmur swept through the room. Claire's family looked pale. Ms. Sharp immediately rose. "Your Honor, regardless of when it was acquired, the house served as the marital residence. Under state law, this can be considered for the division of assets." I cut her off, my tone sharp. "Ms. Sharp, the law is quite clear. A premarital asset of this nature remains the sole property of the original owner. This house belongs to my son, and to him alone." Under the table, Thomas squeezed my hand, but I wasn't finished. I produced a small USB drive. "Your Honor," I said, "I would now like to play a recording made on the evening before our initial hearing." As the clerk played the recording, the room fell silent. Claire's harsh voice filled the air. "Lily, you tell him your father can't take care of you. You tell him you don't want to live with a cripple. Do you understand?" Then, Lily's sobbing response. But I don't want to lie, Mommy. I love Daddy. Finally, Claire's merciless threat. If you don't do what I say, we'll lose everything. The courtroom was in an uproar. Claire leaped to her feet, shouting, "It's a fake! She's trying to frame me!" But her frantic denials convinced no one. Judge Peterson slammed his gavel. "Order! I want to hear from the child. Bring Lily Davenport to the stand." My brave little Lily walked to the stand, her eyes swollen but her gaze clear. She looked so small and vulnerable. "Lily," Claire said, her voice a syrupy sweet threat. "Tell everyone you want to live with Mommy, right?" Lily looked at the judge, and in a small but steady voice that carried through the silent room, she said, "I love my daddy. I'm not going to lie. I want to live with my daddy and my grandma." The room erupted. Thomas broke down, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with relief. I went to Lily and hugged her tightly. I looked directly at Claire. "The truth can't be manipulated, Claire," I said coldly, "and a child knows the truth." Suddenly, Claire stood up, her eyes wild with desperation. "Don't listen to her," she shrieked. "She's a washed-up lawyer. She lost a huge case years ago and had to quit in disgrace. She's a failure." A new wave of murmurs swept the room. Thomas looked down, his knuckles white as he gripped his cane, fearing her words would undo everything. I took a deep breath. The old wound still ached, but I would not let her use my past to hurt my family. I stood tall and addressed the judge. "Yes, I left the legal profession. I lost a case, not because of a lack of evidence, but because the defendant bribed the presiding judge. My honor was sold for dirty money, and I chose to walk away with my integrity intact rather than participate in a corrupt system." The room was silent, every eye on me. Thomas looked up, tears streaming down his face, finally understanding the sacrifice I had made all those years ago. "That judge," I continued, my voice ringing with conviction, "was later investigated and imprisoned for corruption, and I swore that day that I would never again stand by and watch justice be perverted. I am here today not for my own reputation, but for my son, for my granddaughter, and for the truth." At that moment, Judge Peterson leaned forward, his own eyes shining with respect. "I can personally attest to Mrs. Davenport's statement," he said, his voice firm. "I was a young clerk in that very courthouse. It was Eleanor Davenport who exposed the corruption that others were too afraid to touch. She has always valued the law more than anyone I have ever known." The mood in the room shifted from shock to admiration. Claire staggered back into her seat, utterly defeated. Her lawyer shuffled her papers, knowing the case was lost. Judge Peterson stood, his voice resonating with authority. "This court will recess. The final verdict will be delivered at the next session." The gavel came down with a sharp crack, sealing Claire's fate. On the day of the final verdict, the courtroom was a sea of faces. I walked in with Thomas on one arm and Lily holding my other hand. Claire sat at her table, a pale shadow of her former self. The judge entered and a hush fell over the room. He cleared his throat. "After a thorough review of all evidence, the court has reached its verdict. The divorce is granted. Full ownership of the residence remains with Mr. Thomas Davenport. Full custody of the minor, Lily Davenport, is awarded to her father, Mr. Thomas Davenport, and her grandmother, Mrs. Eleanor Davenport. Mrs. Claire Davenport will receive no financial settlement and is granted supervised visitation only." A wave of applause and relieved whispers filled the room. Thomas collapsed against me, sobbing with a relief so profound it shook his entire body. Lily threw her arms around both of us. "We get to stay together," she cried, her tears of joy soaking my jacket. I held them both, my own tears flowing freely, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Our family was safe. Claire jumped up, screaming, "This isn't fair! I'll appeal!" But no one was listening. Her lawyer quietly told her it was over. Defeated, She and her family slunk out of the courtroom under the weight of 100 judgmental stares. I felt no triumph watching her go, only a deep sadness for the woman she had chosen to become. A few days later, we heard that Marcus Thorne had dropped Claire the moment he learned she'd lost the case. She had to sell her expensive things and move into a small, run-down apartment, completely alone. Our life, meanwhile, began anew. I took Thomas to his physical therapy, and slowly, I saw his confidence return. The light came back into his eyes, especially when Lily would run to him and shout, "Daddy, you're my hero." The laughter returned to our home. Our family meals were filled with stories and jokes. One sunny afternoon, I saw Lily in my bedroom, tottering around in a pair of my old heels, pretending to be a lawyer. "Grandma, when I grow up, I'm going to be just like you," she declared. Thomas, watching from his chair on the porch, smiled a true, happy smile. I sat beside him, looking at the beautiful home he had built, and I knew we had weathered the storm. He took my hand. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." I smiled, squeezing his hand. I only did what any mother would do. But I knew in my heart that I had done more. I had fought for my family and for the justice I had always believed in. The bells from the cathedral began to ring, not with a somber toll, but with a clear, joyful sound. We were home, and we were at peace. After everything we went through, I learned that while life can be cruel, the bonds of family and the power of truth are stronger than any lie. Thank you for listening to our story. I tell a new one here every single day, so if you'd like to hear another, please follow the channel and click that little notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's story. For now, I'll leave 2 of our most popular stories on the screen for you. I'm sure you'll find them just as surprising.